And when Rembrandt shows up, and Rembrandt had never gone to Rome. And so you have all these people who are 100 years after Rembrandt are saying, he never went to Rome and studied Raphael, and he never learned how to draw lines like we did. So, of course, Rembrandt's crap because he was never exposed to the great Florentine Roman masters. And
and
so
that still goes on today. There's so much ego in the art world, I swear.
There is. And so as an art historian, you got to figure out, well, like, why were people 100 years after Rembrandt judging him so harshly and in those terms? And then, the words disegno and colore get batted around up until the beginning of the 20th century. There are people debating it until modernism takes over, and then it disappears entirely.
What's colore
Titian
direct translation in English?
Coloring.
That's it? Micah Christensen, welcome back to the show.
I am really happy to be back. This is one that I've wanted to talk to you about a long time. Get ready for some serious controversy, my friend.
Oh,
serious controversy.
I'm excited because we're getting out of Spain. I mean, not Spain. Spanish art's one of my favorite, groups of artists.
Watch your words there. Careful.
Yeah. Okay.
Today we're going to talk about a debate that is that's been raging for 500 years. And
really?
You and your listeners have a stake in, and you don't even know it, but you're going to know it by the end of the day. Okay? By the end of this conversation, you're going to be pitted against one another. This is a wedge issue. I'm going to give you something other than American politics to argue about.
Excellent. Yeah, we need to change.
We're going to talk about two of the greatest artists in the history of Western art, Raphael and Titian, and that they represent, respectively, disegno and colore. We're going to go into what those mean, but what I'm going to start off with is first a little material history, okay? So let's pull up our first image. This is a woman in profile, beautiful colors, right? And beautifully
gorgeous.
Painted. This is neither by Raphael nor Titian. It's
okay.
It's by an artist named Ghirlandaio. But there's a reason I'm bringing him up, and that's because he wasn't that far off from either one of them. He was painting in the 1400s, the 15th century. And what we're dealing with here is this very strange transitional period in the history of painting. If you were a painter working in the 15th century and the 16th century, which is at the cusp of modern art in many ways, where we're using modern materials, you were painting largely on wooden panels, and your material that you're using as your medium is largely tempera painting, which is egg yolks, right? And you could the artists who were using these materials, they had the limitations of those materials. And what I want to do is set up here the difference between the period right before Titian and Raphael and what they represented. So Titian and Raphael were largely the first artists to confidently use oil painting. And that means that they were changing the way that paintings were materially made, right? And I wanted to show you this work as something that was an example of what came just before them, before we talk about what they do. So there's a little bit of oil painting in this, but it's mostly tempera painting.
So where's the oil and where's the tempera?
You'll see it as we do a close-up. So there's a close-up before we go to the close-up.
Okay.
Notice how strong the colors are. This is one of the great benefits of tempera painting. Tempera like I said, it's It's made of whatever pigment you have, whether you're working with lapis lazuli or you're working with ochre or with lead, and you're using as the medium that gets mixed into it egg yolk. And egg yolk is opaque. You can't layer it really, right? So if you're going to do transitions from color to color, it means that you have to do gradually different gradients of color into the next color in very small strokes in order to transition from one tone to the next.
And it dries really fast, I understand.
And it dries very fast. The strengths of tempera are the solidity of that color, right? What's that word? Saturation. Saturation of color is very good with tempera. But notice how, despite it being a beautiful woman, beautiful colors, beautiful and very clear portrait, not really a caricature, it is a little idealized. It is also very stiff. That's the nature of tempera, is that it's hard to get things that look fluid. So go to that very first image in our lineup of the close-up of her eye. So you can see a little bit of layering in the hair. But for the most part, as you zoom in on this, it almost looks like pointillism.
Yeah, it does. I was wondering, as I was looking at the painting, how he got it so smooth, but what it comes down to is just very tiny strokes, one next to the other, in order to create the illusion of a smooth transition.
It is. And that is in and of itself a really remarkable skill, right? Ignore the craquelure here, which is that separation of painting which comes from age. This painting is in the Titian Bornemisza in Madrid. It's one of the most famous paintings of Ghirlandaio, who is himself, really regarded as a great master. And you can see some places where there's layering, like those eyelashes are oil, because they've been dragged subtly over the other work. But Ghirlandaio was not very confident in oil, so he only did it in touches. But if you look above her eyelid, look at how the strokes are in a particular direction, right? They kind of mimic the musculature or the bone structure, and they're very carefully. He's got one color after another. That is an opaque color next to an opaque color next to an opaque color. So if you are an artist who's working in tempera painting in the era right before oil painting gets introduced, the skill set is one largely of drawing, right? You've got to get your drawing down really, really well, because your control of the thickness of line, the density or thinness of that line, your control of how heavy you lay a color into one area. Darks and lights are really important with tempera painting, right? And one of the last things you think about is color. The thing you think about most is line, and that is called in Italian disegno. Disegno is line, right? We think of generally design today as being just the skill of putting together something. But disegno is basically a skill that comes out of this tempera painting. It's one of, let's carefully plan the whole thing out as a line drawing, and then color comes afterwards.
So it's almost like a paint by number.
Almost a paint by number. And these guys would be leaning over their panels that were meticulously smoothed and prepared. They would have a series of drawings that they would do before they would do the final painting, and they would probably even sometimes grid the panel itself and make sure that it was laid down exactly in tempera with the tempera before they put any tempera down. They would usually have a line drawing graphite on the white surface of that panel, and then they would paint slowly the colors over it in tempera, and the painting would be built up, not like you'd build up an oil painting, because you usually have with an oil painting a ground, and then you have areas that are certain colors that you want to pull out, right? Sometimes they would do that in tempera painting, but largely it was like, you just kind of fill in a drawing paint by number wise, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this meant that you're leaning over the canvas with very small brushes, and usually you have to have very good eyes, or you have to have a magnifying glass that you're looking through as you're painting.
But not canvas. That's the kind of work, right? They're working on board, to be clear.
Yeah.
Okay.
They're working on prepared. In Italy, they're working mostly on beech or pine panels that have been covered in a gesso, which is like plaster, that have been sanded down. It's so smooth that it was almost like porcelain, and they're painting into that gesso, and the tempera gets sucked into that. So this is what is happening at the end or the middle of the 1400s, and then oil painting gets introduced to the Italians. The Northern Europe had oil, but there's not a whole lot of communication going on between Northern Europe and Italy. And Italy is really, for all intents and purposes, the center of the art world. It's where the Renaissance is happening. It's where the money is. It's where big projects are happening. So the next image I want you to pull up is the crucifixion scene. So this is one of the earliest paintings ever done by Raphael. Raphael is maybe the most copied artist in the history of art. More books have been written on Raphael than probably all of 19th or 18th century art combined. More art theories have been done about him. More paintings have been copied, like I said. He is probably the most influential artist, whether or not you know him directly or not, in the history of Western art. And he died at the age of 37.
Ouch.
So he's born in, very young age. He was born in Urbino, and you have to think of Italy as being multiple kingdoms. It's not unified until the 1870s. So he's living there. He's born in 1483, and he's born in this very small kingdom of Urbino. And Urbino is it's wealthy, but it's not one of the big powerhouses. The big powerhouses of the time are Naples, Rome, Venice, Genoa. They're the ones who really have their own armies. They have a lot more land. They have a lot more wealth. But there are a few places like Urbino, where he came from, that have influenced because of the artistry that's coming from there. And the artistry that was coming from Urbino was largely ceramics. And his father was a decorator of plates, like beautiful plates. We're not talking like the kind you'd eat off of. We're talking about things that are worth millions of dollars today. If you go to places like the Wallace Collection or the Metropolitan Museum or the Frick, you can see some of these plates that his father and others were doing. And Raphael takes a liking to painting. He starts working with an artist named Perugino, who does work that is almost exactly like this, and Raphael's copying him. I wanted to show this because he's working in oil mostly. There's a little bit of tempera in here, but something you immediately notice that's different than the work we were just looking at is just notice there's the transition in the skin tones of the body of Christ on the cross.
Just right? Soft and subtle.
It's soft. It's very soft. This is kind of the first generation of oil painters. However, even though it's soft and you see a little bit of the influence of that being soft transitions of those skin tones, overall, the painting to our modern eyes looks extremely formulaic. Even notice, look at the hair, by the way. And we've got to be careful when we look at some of these images by today's standards, not only because they had a different way of looking at them, but also because these paintings have aged, and oil paint thins over time. So this is not exactly what it looked like. His skin would have looked a lot more vital. It's been, not to play too much on words, but the painting has been skinned, which means that it's been over cleaned. So you've lost some of the top layers of those paint just through it being an old painting that, every 50 to 100 years, a painting usually gets cleaned. And they were really aggressive in the 18th and 19th and early 20th centuries, sometimes just taking soap and horsehair brushes and just going over them and then repainting whatever they had problems with. So we may be seeing only 30 to 40% of Raphael here, right? Not the whole Raphael. Yeah, but back up on the painting, and I'll show you something that I think is interesting to think about. He was hugely influenced by a generation of artists who were painting in books, illuminated manuscripts. So look at some of the designs, those ribbons that are coming off the angels on the other side. The fact that if you cut it right down the center, it's almost like a copy of it. It's like it's exactly the word I'm looking for, right? Like it's a
totally
book leaf.
Symmetrical.
Symmetrical. That's the word I was looking for. And all the figures are pretty much not sitting in realistic space. They're in this space right under the cross. They're within the same 4 feet, right? It's all symbolic. It's not actual physical space we're seeing. There is a real attempt with the landscape, which is, I think, actually quite poetic, a beautiful little landscape of, and this is actually how scientifically light works. If you look at a landscape, light goes brown in the foreground because those are shortwave light, green in the middle ground because that's kind of middle grade light, and then blue in the distance because that's what long wave looks like on the light spectrum. So if you're ever standing on top of a mountain and you look out, that's what light looks like. The things closer to you look browner, things in the middle look greener, and the things in the distant look bluer. And they knew that even though they didn't know the science about it. And so when they're doing a landscape, he's creating perspective in a very little amount of space just through color. But see how he's transitioning the color. It's not using tempera, or else he wouldn't be able to get such smooth transitions from the brown to the yellow, green, blue. This is kind of the beginnings of what you see with this early era. It's a mix of stiffness and formulaic painting, and a mix of smooth, lifelike transition, observation of how real life works. Raphael starts to develop this vocabulary of how he's doing things, and one of the things that you can see here that exists in later Raphael is, notice his use of color in the composition. This has influenced all artists since. This is what he became really known for. If you follow the reds around the canvas, that crimson, it pulls you throughout the canvas. If you follow the greens, it follows you. You can pull it through the canvas. It's almost like, and it's not, that is not book leaf. That's not symmetrical every time. He's doing deliberate, subtle, compositional choices. We'll see better examples of it later, but I mean, here he's in his teens when he's painting, right?
Wow.
And this is a big piece. It's something like 8 or 9 feet high, and he's doing, I think it may be even taller than that, and he's doing these things that are little, tiny, beautiful moments. Like, for instance, look at those angels. They're symmetrical, but the ribbons aren't the same shape or size. They're both standing on tiny little clouds. They're the folds in their clothing. They're little subtle transitions. Even as a little kid, I want to say he's not really a little kid. He's a teenager, which basically is like probably being in our 30s or 40s by their lifetime standards.
Yeah, seriously.
Not exactly. But he's making very subtle choices compositionally that we'll see play out later. I want to move you to the next painting, and then I'll ask you some questions. I'm just setting this up at the
Well,
beginning.
I
This
want to
is
ask one
Dizania. This is
question before you move on. We
yeah,
move
go ahead.
on, and maybe you can comment on this, but it almost feels like he's working in a primary palette, which is primary green, primary red, primary blue, and yellow. It's very simple.
This yeah, this is a really important point. I'm glad you brought this up. So there are only about 30 colors that they can work with at this point, and that's true up until the first artificial or chemically created color that's different than those is Prussian blue that's created in the mid 1700s, early 1700s. And so everybody's using the same palette, but the quality of the color has to do with how wealthy your patron is. So you've got, out of those 30 colors, you've got about 8 to 12 minerals that you can work with. And those minerals are super expensive. So lapis lazuli, which they call ultramarine, comes from Afghanistan at their time, and it's largely controlled by Venice, and it costs more money than gold does. And if you can't afford lapis lazuli, you use cobalt, which comes from Iran, which is not as expensive, but is still expensive. And if you can't use cobalt, you use aquamarine, which comes from copper, and it's a greenish blue. And then the lowest of low colors is smalt, which is this really weird derivative blue color. So you've only got like 4 or 5 blues that you can use. And when you would commission a painting, let's say I came to you, Jeff, I would go to the local guild of artists and I'd say, I want to commission a portrait of my wife standing at the foot of the cross, and I want Jeff Hine to do it, and I want it to be 50% done by him and 50% to be done by his journeyman. So I get a bit of a discount on it. I want Jeff to come in and finish the faces and the hands. But I don't want to pay for him full time to do it because that's a little too pricey. It's good enough that I get his assistance. And I want to go full lapis lazuli. That's how I'm going to spend my money on this. So I'm going to dictate that I want the robes done in lapis lazuli. Or I want them done in this copper green, or I want them to be done in this color. And as a result, because I'm paying for the pigments outright, you're going to give me an undiluted version of that pigment in the painting, right? Because I am paying damage. You're not gonna water down that lapis lazuli, right? You're not gonna water down that green because I paid for that to be done that way, right? So where Raphael is working in his early years, he has the medium expensive colors. And most of his career, even though he starts in Urbino, goes to Florence, then ends up in Rome working directly for the Pope, he never has access to the best colors. These are kind of like the just above the cheap colors that he's using.
Right, right. Okay, the next painting is what?
Okay, so this is actually Bacchus and Ariadne. Let me tell you what's going on in this painting. It's by Titian. And can we zoom in and like make it? Well, this fills the screen pretty much, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. If there's a particular area you want me to look at, let me know.
Yeah, I will. Let's keep it general for right now. Titian comes from the north of Italy in near Venice, and he becomes the king of Venice and its painting. Venice controls most of the Adriatic Sea, a huge amount of trade on the ocean, and therefore they're able to get through trade routes the best colors. Titian has access to the best colors that any artist could possibly have at the time, and he uses them to maximum effect. And he's lavish in his use of color. This painting depicts the moment that Ariadne gets dropped off on the island where Bacchus, the god of wine, and his revelers, his partygoers, are all living. and I believe it's Jason from Jason and the Argonauts. She's supposed to be wedded to him. No. It's Theseus. Theseus is the one who, or Theseus is the one who leaves her on the island for a time, promising he'll come back. But Bacchus sees her; she's mortal. Falls in love with her. When the moment he sees her, he jumps from his chariot. That's what he's doing in midair.
Oh, and I see that now. Yeah.
His revelers are coming with him, and they have fun. And in the end, she gets quartered and killed and eaten by the animals on the island. It's a really ugly death. However, if you're Titian and you're living in a world where most of the work that had been done right before you was very carefully painted linear drawings, essentially, in tempera, and everything's very stiff, you have just blown the minds of everybody if you see a leaping figure in a painting and it looks somewhat realistic, right? The motion in this painting is the thing that would have blown everybody's minds when they saw it. It would have been like seeing, when I was a kid, Jurassic Park CGI dinosaur for the first time. And the difference between the claymation dinosaur that was stop motion and seeing a dinosaur that looked real, that was AI generated, or not like computer generated, that is. It would have, AI is a whole other thing. That'll be another level of mind blowing, right? So what he's able to do with oil that no one else, that really blows the minds of everyone, is this sense of real motion and movement. That's very different than what Raphael is doing. Raphael is doing transitions in skin tone, color, landscape, and he's thinking of color in really interesting compositional ways. Titian is thinking of movement and motion. And he's thinking of color that is eye-popping in almost every way. You can see that that we're not seeing the full painting, by the way, as it originally was. You see all that brown that's in that figure in the ground, and also the brown that's in the trees in the far top right. They would have looked much richer. The problem is that when these paints were originally put on the canvas, he was using some earth and vegetable colors that weren't fully saturated in the oil. And so they became oxygenated and just went brown over time.
Oh, bummer.
Right? Almost like rust. Like they almost rusted over time, those colors. So it's not entirely fair, but you can see enough to see that Titian is doing some really interesting, like, look at the leg of that woman who has the lapis lazuli skirt. Look at how beautiful the transition and observation from life is of what musculature looks like, and how he's really managing with look at the warmth in the kneecap and the toes.
Okay, so I want to ask you one thing here. So I'm a little confused about something. Maybe you could expound on it a little bit more. Why is the medium of egg tempera the thing that made it difficult to create motion? I'm not really making that connection, because I can see why you're not, it would make it difficult to render form, but I don't understand the connection between the medium and drawing a figure in motion.
It's a good question. I think that I don't know if you've ever seen somebody's drawings and then you see their paintings, and their paintings look stiff, but their drawings look full of life. Tempera has the general effect of making everything look even stiffer than that in that transition. And so I think artists were aware of that, and they attempted less.
Oh.
They tend to make more posed images in tempera, right? Because they just realized there was a certain futility in attempting to take a really lifelike moment and try and put it into tempera, because very few people were able to do it successfully. So they tamped down their attempts to do it. And the moment they had oil and there was more fluidity to it, I think that they became more brazen in their attempts. Not that it wasn't possible.
I understand.
Not that it wasn't possible, but it became more possible. That's my art historical explanation. But I also think there was definitely a taste for it.
So they were just happy. You're suggesting an artist might have just been happy to get a well-rendered face with egg tempera because it was much more of a stubborn, difficult medium. But then when they were presented with a much more forgiving medium, then they're like, oh, well, now it's so much easier to paint. Now I'm going to try much more difficult subjects.
Yeah.
Is that what you're suggesting?
And yes, and I'll give you a comparison. So I was looking at, I was watching an interview with the guy who was behind the hair in Disney's movie Tangled, which is Rapunzel and her hair that they first proposed, and they were doing it in drawings, that her hair have all of these abilities to do motion. And the computer people said, we can't do that. You're going to have to get rid of the hair. And they're like, no. This is Tangled. Like, her hair's got to be fluid and dance and move, and it's got to be able to break down into individual strands. And they had a relationship with the people at Pixar, even though it's mostly a Disney film. There was a relationship with them. And the guy that they interviewed said, basically, the difference between the computers they used to make Toy Story to the ones that they helped to model the hair and control the behavior of the hair in Tangled was the difference of 1,000 times the computer power. And so they had to get rid of, they wouldn't have been able to do it in the first movie. They had to like simplify forms in the movie, in the early Pixar films and in Toy Story. And that's why it helped to have them be toys. They didn't have skin tone transitions. They didn't have webs between fingers. They didn't have to deal with any of that stuff, right? They didn't have to deal with hair. It was all solid. But then the moment they moved into something like human hair, they had to have, they couldn't have made that choice. I think oil had a very similar transition, is that, like, look at, for instance, if we're zeroed in here and you're looking at Bacchus jumping out of that chariot, and you can see that his right leg is really like full on straight in front of us in the foreground. But then look at the distance that he is willing to take that back left leg, right? And what's the word I'm looking for? It's
perspective.
Yeah, there's foreshortening. The foreshortening that he's willing to do there would not have really been attempted by a tempera painter.
Mm-hmm.
And part of it is look at how he's able in that darkness to have a lot of those skin tones still come out with the layers of oil paint that he would have been hard to do in tempera, an opaque color set. An opaque, it's something that's really hard to describe, I think, unless you do look at the difference between, like, just pull up this painting and the Ghirlandaio of that woman right next to one another that we had of her portrait. They're not the best comparison side by side, but they're good. They're good enough.
Those are really too big to put side by side. That's a bummer. So I'm just going to go.
That's right.
Because we can't put them side by side. Let me just go back and forth. So we got this one.
Okay.
And then this one.
I mean, just look at the difference in transition and skin tones in just the Bacchus figure versus this woman.
Mm-hmm.
There's no question that Ghirlandaio, who's doing this portrait, has a great deal of skill, but he's essentially working with a tiny brush, going one color transition to the next. Whereas Titian, and this is what makes him Titian, and we're going to talk about it a little more, Titian is not really a draftsman when it comes to drawing, unlike Raphael. He usually
Really?
does very little drawing. He does some outlines in charcoal directly onto the canvas, and then starts painting and building up the paints as he goes. And he's the first artist to really do this. And it becomes a distinct Venetian, Northern Italian way of painting, of instead of doing meticulous drawings and then transferring them onto canvas and then painting the colors, Titian goes directly onto the canvas. In fact, one of Titian's first things, and I didn't show this as a painting because we just talked forever about these two. Titian is credited as being the first artist to use canvas in the first place. Everybody in his world is using to do small paintings, panel work. But if they're doing large paintings, they're doing frescoes. They're painting into plaster. And he's commissioned to do a painting on a wall of the Academia of the Virgin Mary as a young girl climbing some stairs. It's about, I think, 14 feet long, and oil doesn't work in the fresco painting world, and that's his skill set. So what he does is he goes to sailmakers in the port of Venice, and he says, "I think I can paint directly onto a sail."
So he invented this method?
Yeah. And so he says, "What I want you to do is I want to weave me a sail that's such a size, and then we'll stretch it on wood, and then I'm going to be able to build up my oil paints in a way that I could never do in fresco painting, because fresco painting is almost exactly like tempera painting. You have to use opaque solid colors, right? But he wants to build up the layers to get those transitions. So almost all of Titian's paintings are on canvas, and he changes the world by, instead of doing drawing on paper or leather, vellum, whatever it is you're working on, and then moving on to a panel where you're doing the drawing and then doing almost color by number, paint by number. He's the first one to say, no, I'm just going to do light drawing on the canvas, and then we're going to build up the oil paint and get there that way. That's how we're going to do it. And that's how this painting was made.
So when you say that he wasn't a draftsman, what you mean is that he wasn't one that was likely to work in dry media.
That's right. We have very few drawings by Titian. Most of them are of landscapes.
Okay.
But we can see almost always how he drew because of what we can see underneath his paintings, either through some kind of radiography. And there are a couple that I'll give you a really good example of it in a moment. But what I'm setting up here is this controversial debate. So the history of the art that is largely with us today, when you're doing figurative art in particular, is one that came from Raphael and his school of art, right? Raphael goes from Urbino, where he's doing that first painting that I showed you, to going to Florence, where he gets hugely influenced by Da Vinci. And Da Vinci's a big draftsman, right? He's drawing everything, getting it perfect on paper, and then he's building up the canvas doing drawing, color studies, and then combination of drawing and color study to the final piece. That's how it gets taught in the academy throughout all of Europe from then on, right? It's, you go to France and you study the École des Beaux-Arts, and you are you're all the way up to John Singer Sargent. John Singer Sargent may not be the best example of this, but a lot of these academic artists that we love so much in the 19th century, they learned the disegno approach. They are the ones who, they plan out something on paper as a line drawing, and then build color into it later. Right?
Okay, let me plant a seed for you real quick. Just in case we're going in two different directions. I just want to plant this seed in your mind. And also, I want to ask those who are listening to comment on this, because I might be unique in this. I don't think so, but I might be. I think of draftsmanship as completely separate from the medium. Draftsmanship is the ability to create accurate proportion. So whether you're in paint or you're in graphite or you're in charcoal, a good draftsman is one who draws accurately, or one who creates accurate proportion. And a poor draftsman is one who is unable to. So that's that way I perceive draftsmanship. And again, if those who are listening, I'd be interested in your thoughts. So I just want to plant that seed.
Yeah, and I don't think you're not incorrect. I mean it in the classical use of the term, disegno. Disegno was you meticulously plan everything. It's usually idealized. It's not from nature. It's composed from you're composing it from your mind first and coming up with the idea. We call this a Platonic view of art, that everything comes from an ideal, perfect version of the world. That's the disegno version, and the way that you're creating the world. And maybe I'm using the word draftsmanship from an earlier era, and you're using it from the current era. This is kind of how Titian and Raphael would have used it. But disegno is probably the best. If we just stuck with the Italian, it's even better, right? Disegno is idealized form, idealized composition, not from nature, and done in a way that starts with drawing and first, and then adding in color later. Colore, which is the world Titian comes from, is observed from nature, from real life, using models, using nature as you see it, and building things up with color in an almost extemporaneous way. I mean, they weren't improvising. They had an idea of where they were going, but they were building it up on the canvas with a lot less preparatory work than was done in the other world. And the results are that in Titian, you usually get more emphasis on color, on motion, and on observable nature. Look at just the musculature and skin of the figures that are around Bacchus in this painting.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Look at how and look at the trees and how it's built up. Yes, it's not exactly how the world. This isn't what a group of people walking around looks like, right? I mean, it's all exaggerated. That's not what two cheetahs. There were no two cheetahs hanging out tied to a chariot in his world. There's a lot of fanciful dream work going on here. In fact, I would challenge people who are looking at this painting. This is where I have to back off on some of the things I've said. If you tried to adopt that pose of Ariadne on the far left, putting your right hand forward, your head turned to the side, your other hand behind your waist, your right leg behind you, that is not a natural position of that woman on the far left. He's starting to look at Greco-Roman sculptures, but compositionally it works perfectly. And we also know that he added in that red, controversially, around her in order to make her stick out from the blue on that left-hand side. And the reason it was controversial is because he had to cover up lapis lazuli, expensive pigment, with a cheaper red pigment to do it. But he decided that compositionally it needed it to make her figure stand out from the blue ocean and the blue sky. So he's not observing from nature in the way that we would think of it. I want to skip to... We're going to get more into this as we look at other paints. Go to a drawing. Any one of these drawings. These are all Raphael. What do you think as someone who regularly draws and paints the human figure about Raphael?
Well, I want to pull up
He's
this
in his
drawing
20s here.
because this drawing is the one I pulled up earlier before we started recording, and I was just like floored. This drawing.
What floored? Which part of it floors you? What floors you about it?
The movement, the elegance in the line work, the editing in that he puts focus in certain areas and lets other areas sort of disappear. He refines particular edges, leaves other edges softer and lighter. It's just, I don't know how else to describe it. It's just beautiful. And the whole composition of all these figures together is just exquisite to me.
It's beautiful, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, look at the kneeling woman. It's one of my favorites that is of this era.
Right.
That he does the drawing of the woman who's it's just such a beautiful line. Paper was very expensive at this time. You would often reuse the same sheet or draw multiple times on the same sheet. So you can see some erasure on it. You can see a close-up of her hand. He learns through observing mostly Leonardo and people of his time that were working in Florence. That's when he's doing these drawings. And it was later summarized by Vasari that the way that these Florentine artists thought about art was you don't want to draw a hand that you see. You want to draw the perfect hand. And if you and this is something that you do as a teacher all the time, is you usually get simplified forms that are casts, right, of sculptures that have simplified in beautiful ways those forms. That is a Florentine idea. I'll give you an example in real life. Years ago, I was in the studio of Arnold Friedberg. Arnold Friedberg studied at the Art Students League of New York and was just a generation below Norman Rockwell. And he knew Norman Rockwell, and he also had done Saturday Evening Post and Life and Boys Life covers Arnold Friedberg had. And I remember I went into his studio. He must have been 92 at the time, and I was in my mid-20s. And he had this reindeer that had a Christmas wreath on it that had been a cover of a Life magazine, and it was the original oil. And I said, "Oh, Arnold, that looks just like Norman Rockwell." Shouldn't have said that. The moment I said that, his face went red and he got angry and his voice got louder and he said, "Norman Rockwell would have picked any damn reindeer. I picked the best left antler from one reindeer, the best right antler from another reindeer, the best left eye from one reindeer, the best right eye from another reindeer, the best nose, the best fur, the best this." It was a composite of 20 reindeer in his mind, whereas Norman Rockwell was too lazy to pick all the best elements and would paint a subpar single reindeer.
This was his perspective, to clarify, because I don't know that I agree with that. But okay, this was his perspective.
No, I don't agree with it either. But his perspective illustrates how Raphael's world saw Titian's world. Raphael's world was disegno. Disegno was about idealized perfection. Before you even put anything on the canvas, every line, every emphasis, everything was perfect. Then when you go to the canvas, you make everything idealized and beautiful, right? And it's just, you don't even show your strokes. You want to work on panel and you're using a brush. And by the way, they only had round brushes because that metal ferrule that goes on brushes today, that allows you to crimp and make something square, didn't exist until the 19th or the late 18th century. So they're still 300 years before that. What they do is they paint with these round brushes, and then they go back over it with a rabbit fur brush, which gets rid of all signs of a stroke. It's perfect, right? It's porcelain. So if you go to the painting of the triangle, I'll show you what his painting ends up looking like that becomes the most influential. This is him at his prime. Raphael at his prime. This is the most influential style in the history of art in the world, right? I am showing you right now the basis for almost all Western art in academies. and that is triangles as a composition, the most important figure in the brightest light, all their gestures leading around clearly in a line towards one another. I mean, look at, so this is this is Mary, the Madonna, the mother of Christ. Christ, if you follow her eye, she's looking at John the Baptist, who's kneeling in front, and then he's looking at Christ. All of that is kind of a circular motion of gesture, right? Even look at the hands and the arms. Look at how her shoulder leads down the sleeve, almost touching John the Baptist. Then you go down John the Baptist and you take his arm, and his right arm then leads up towards Christ, and the staff is leaning. You see her foot is the end of one part of the triangle, and John the Baptist, the child's foot, is the other side of the isosceles triangle. You see that Christ is in the center, and he's the brightest of all the figures. You see that her face, if we just take her face, idealized face, that's not a real face or nose, right? But you see exactly where her head is turned because of the way that her hair is parted. It goes down to her nose, which then goes down to her chin, which has a tiny divot in it. You know where her sternum is because of that little gold decorative demi-lune that's on the part of her chest. There are all kinds of very carefully planned decorative compositional moments. You know where her shoulders are because of where the sleeve line is. You know where her breasts end and where her waist begins because of where that little line is of the thing. That's not real clothing, right? Mm-hmm. It's all invented for composition's sake. This isn't really observable life in any way, right? It's idealized, but it's beautifully planned. I mean, it is planned so no matter where you go in the painting, it pulls you around. It kind of feels like basic version of what we're used to now. This is like, what are the early Lego blocks that they give little kids, that are the bigger versions of Legos?
I don't remember. I know what you're talking about, though.
Yeah, you know what I'm talking about? Like, this is the big Lincoln log version that all of Western art is based on. You would go into any art school in the 19th century, 18th century, 17th century, and they would pull up Raphael and they would say to you, look at how he's managed the relationships between the figures. Look at how he's managed the colors in here to draw your eye around. This is early mature Raphael, but go to The Woman with the Wheel and you'll see a later, more complicated version of it.
Let me ask you, do you know where this painting is?
This one, I think, is in the National Gallery in London.
Oh, because there's one.
And it's not big.
There's one almost just like it in D.C. I just saw it.
Yeah. There is. There is one almost like it in D.C. Go to the one with the wagon wheel, and there's so many versions of these, and they're copied. So it's two more over. Go two more over from that to your right. Yep, right there. This is St. Catherine. She was killed on this. So you see how there's a wagon wheel underneath her left arm. She was strapped to one of those and tortured to death, and she becomes a symbol of the Wheel of Fortune, because sometimes you're at the height of the wheel and sometimes you're at the bottom of the wheel in life, and she kind of becomes the symbol of this. Notice how entirely invented her pose is. I mean, if you just try and do it, take your right arm and put it on your chest, and then turn your head in that direction, but make your left leg go in front, like and your right.
Yeah. I feel quite dainty though when trying it. Yeah.
But isn't it the most beautifully linear, smooth, serpentine use of the body and form? It's gorgeous, right? It's gorgeous. And you see where all of her anatomy is because of the colors. Again, the clothing is nonsense. Green sleeve, that beautiful furl of the robe, the inside of the yellow that curves around her hip. That no clothing sits like that. totally invented, idealized disegno. This is disegno at its height, right? I mean, it has nothing to do with the way the real world works. It's all beautiful, though. And it's something that artists tried to imitate for the longest time. Raphael, probably the world goes into, you know, if you sorted Western art education, 90% of it is disegno. 10% of it is colore. And some of the artists who represent colore over time are Rubens is colore. Delacroix is colore. You would even argue that Van Gogh is colore, right? It's not about it's about and we'll get to what Titian looks like, but we'll talk more about colore. But if you think about disegno, who is disegno? Eng is disegno. Jerome is disegno. Bouguereau is disegno. All of these artists who are forcing the human figure into idealized form that is very pleasing, but not really observable. They're pulling a hat trick, right? No one looks at this painting at first and thinks, oh, that's not how people stand. That's stupid. I hate it.
No.
You know what I mean? They don't look at that. They look at it and they think, oh, that's beautiful, right? Caravaggio, in his own twisted way, is disegno. Because even though he's doing blood and guts, everything is beautifully planned and beautifully linear in the way that it's done. You know who isn't disegno, who's colore, is Rembrandt. Rembrandt is colore. And so you can see how the world gets divided into these figures of Raphael, in some ways, is continuing the tradition of the best of tempera, right? It's very carefully planned linear drawing, and all the strengths of that line tradition and design that creates idealized forms. If you put this next to the woman who has her of the Dio, of the woman who has her who's sitting in profile, there's a lot of similarities in the way that lines are solid, they're firm all the way through it. However, Raphael also has beautiful skin transitions. And I mean, you wouldn't think that Raphael's drawings look as free and observable from life. Those three men, or those four men that we looked at, if you had to say that they're the same artist, you'd think, well, like, this is the same artist as the guy who just did this.
No, it looks more like Titian
in the wheel. Yeah.
Okay, so that brings up a question for me. Okay. Now, his process, I wonder if it is all invented 100% though. My suspicion is...
No, it's an exaggeration.
Yeah, my suspicion is that he did studies from life and then worked from studies, because you've seen many studies of him doing fabric, like very elaborate fabric studies and so on and so forth. And my suspicion is he did that from life and then only worked from drawings from that point on, and then would at that point would start to idealize. There's two reasons I think that. One is because the drawing evidence suggests that to me personally, but two, because I tried a drawing from life, or I tried a painting entirely from drawings many years ago. Don't even remember why I did it. I think it was just a personal challenge where I did all the drawings from observation, and then it was a multi-figure painting with lots of figures. And then I did the whole painting from the drawings, and I found myself almost being forced to idealize, because drawings are limited in their information. And so I found myself having to kind of improvise a lot. And the best way to improvise is to idealize. You certainly don't want to improvise by making things look worse, right? You improvise by making things more ideal. Now, I shouldn't say that I believe that because I tried it once that I know everything. I don't. It's just It's just what I imagine to be true, and I'm obviously not sure. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I have two thoughts. One is I'm reminded of a story that was from the journals or the letters of Claude Monet. Monet studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris in the 1860s. And as a student, you would work with isolated parts, casts, plaster casts of a Greco-Roman sculpture, and then you'd work on the full Greco-Roman sculpture as you got better, and then you would eventually be led into the nude from life drawing class, of which the people posing in the nude were often posing in the same position as the Greco-Roman sculpture. And so his teacher was Glier, who is one of these forgotten masters that is worth talking about one of these days. And he writes in a letter to his friend, he says, so I was in the life drawing class today with Glier, and Glier comes up and he says, no, 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 no. You're supposed to draw from the antique, not from the life, the antique. And what that meant was that Monet was not supposed to draw what he saw in front of him. He was supposed to look at the figure in front of him and use it as impose on top of it the Greco-Roman cast and idealize the musculature, idealize the form, simplify everything, and make that what he drew in front of him. And his teacher was grading him on his ability to look at a form that was in front of him and to simplify it and idealize it in a way that was better than what was in front of him. And Monet says, I went home that night and I took the drawing and I drew 26 moles and I put 26 hairs on every mole. in order to like stick his thumb in the eye of Glier, right? And it's interesting because I think that we lionize that attitude of get away from the idealization of the world. But then I don't know how many bad 19th century paintings I've seen done from photographs when the art was new, where you knew that the person paid for their family and friends to have all their individual portraits put into it, but there's no way that the artist could sit with all of them. And so he painted all their bodies. He had like stand-ins, and then he had photos, and he did highly detailed paintings of every face, no matter where they were in the painting, right? And so the painting looks busy and sloppy, and it's not because he's a bad artist in the sense that he couldn't do a good photograph, a copy of the photograph. It's because he actually did the photograph, right? He didn't idealize anything. He made it all look like he didn't learn how to like emphasize and de-emphasize things, right? And I think that this is where Raphael and the Disegno school has the upper hand, is that the eye, your eye and what you look at on a neurological level, what you see, if you just look at the world around you, about 30% of it is actually what you're seeing, and 70 to 80% of it is invented by your brain. Because if you had to process everything you're seeing all the time, it would take up too much brain power, too much power.
Is that a fact?
So your brain invents a lot. Yeah, it's true. So your brain invents a lot of things, a lot in your peripheral vision, a lot of what's in front of you is invented based on past experience. That's where Disegno and idealization works.
So is
really
that why
well.
you look good, so good today?
It is why I look fantastic. That's on
It's not real.
As I really
it's
am,
not real. I just assumed you would look good.
The real me would horrify you. But it's why we look at this form and we don't look at it and immediately think it's an unrealistic pose. Because our brain's design part takes over and we immediately think of the pleasing lines and shapes. It's like they found the underlying code, like these Disegno perspective found the underlying code. And they're basing it on what they believe is Greco-Roman simplification of form, beauty, and line too, right? So this is where you get these hardcore people who don't believe in working from photographs. They don't believe in working from life. They believe in drawing an idealized form. They come from the Disegno school. This is where I want our viewers to fight, right? I want them to get into camps where there are people who say, Raphael's way of doing it is the right way, damn it, because we don't want to look at real nature, because real nature is not as beautiful or as interesting as the idealized reindeer. The idealized reindeer is the reindeer that we want to aim for in art, not the crappy garbage reindeer that just walked in our door, right?
Yeah.
Now move to the painting of the people walking up to the altar, which is Titian, and I'm going to show you a radically different view of life. This is not the most ingenious painting, but I want you to zero. This is a painting of, I think, the Alfarini family. It's in the National Gallery in London, and it's meant to echo the architecture and space of the chapel that it was in. And so if you were in the chapel, it would be physically up in the air about 10 feet, and it would be a continuation of the stone and architecture in the building. And it would look like you were looking out into the sky and these people were standing above you, which is why the perspective is the way it is, why that guy's looking down at you that's in the middle, and why those kids are kind of looking down that are on the far left. So it's not the best Titian in the world, but there's a reason I chose it. Go in on that red robe on the left by where those boys are, to, below where the sleeve dangles down. Go farther left and down. Even down farther. Go to the bottom of the painting almost.
Down under the fur.
Yep, right there. Okay. Yeah. So, do you see that line that's right off the fur? It's just a single charcoal looking line.
There's a bunch
and you
of
see
lines.
All the lines.
They're all over the place. You got one here.
That's what Titian's drawing looks like.
No kidding.
This is what we call pediment. We call this pedimenti in art history. It literally just means where things stand. As oil paint gets thinner over time, sometimes you can see through it to the under layers. That's his charcoal drawing of him imagining where that man's foot is, and you can see a lot of lines. That's how sparse his drawing was when he would do something. He would outlay the figure. He would do the figure almost as if he was doing a stick figure. That's the guy's calf that's coming off of that sleeve.
Look at that.
You can see a little lower. You can see it a little lower than that. That's his calf where he pictures him.
Oh, so right
now pull
here,
back,
right here.
And you can see.
Oh, this is his thigh.
And that's his shin.
Thigh and calf.
Yep.
I didn't even make that out. And then this is the edge of the stair right here.
Yep. And that's as little as Titian would draw. Now back up.
Wow, that is too cool.
On the painting. Isn't that cool? And now you look at it and you think, okay, he really did understand. He built up the paint after that and just drew with the brush as he went along. Raphael would have never done that. Right? Raphael would have never done that. So what you'd have is you'd have almost like this really basic bamboo infrastructure of a building that Titian would make with charcoal right onto this big canvas. And then he would dig in with his brush and he would draw shapes and build up oil paints over time with color. And that is colore. That is the different approach. And the difference is his people and his gestures look much more realistic and observational.
Well, I was thinking that he looks like a naturalist several hundred years before naturalists showed up.
Yeah, and his approach doesn't take off in the history of art for the most part, because I think it's harder to teach, for one. It's a lot easier to teach a group of students, let's get your drawing skills down. Right. And then let's add color and let's do this and do, we'll build it up. And you can judge each stage of it. Titian was truly a genius in his ability to be one of the first painters of oil, right? He invents this canvas approach which allows him to do, oh, and by the way, zoom in on that sleeve again. Or maybe this isn't the best example. let's go to the Man on a Horse.
Okay.
The Man on the Horse is one of his most important commissions. He works for Charles V, who's the King of Spain. This is a huge file. I don't know if you can zoom in on that armor.
Oh, there we go.
Or the face. Zoom in on, I mean, this is like 190 megs, gigapixel piece, and come in on his armor and his face.
Wow. That armor looks awesome.
And this is Titian. You know, this is, Raphael would have never done this ever, ever in his life, right? Because this is, and this is Titian, I think, in his 60s. Titian lives to believe, depending on whose birth date you believe, he didn't really know his birth date, so he claimed it at different times. He either died in his late 80s or he died at the age of 99. We don't know, but he painted for a very, very long time.
Wow.
And the great thing about Titian, I'll give you another example that's even more. This is, look at the horse. Look at how real. These were people who paid tons of money for the armor, 10 times the amount they paid for the painting they paid for the armor, and 100 times they paid for the horse, right? So he had to get those things right. And in person, this is an enormous painting. This is like 10 feet high by 10 feet wide. And if you want a smaller painting that's maybe more comparable to that Catherine with the wagon wheel of straight across Titian versus straight across Raphael, go to the Mary Magdalene of the woman who's sitting with her, little more. There you are, that one. Titian must have painted 10 or 15 different versions of this. Go to her hands, her hand that's on her chest.
Yeah, that's clearly observation.
Yeah. And look at that hair, and look at the and look at how around her fingers he's got visible strokes of these loaded brushes that he's pulling across the canvas.
Yeah, like right
and
here.
And allowing the brush. So Titian, this is the definition for many people of colore. Colore is by definition messier. It's observational of life. The draftsmanship in today's terms, it's not, they would have said that he was inaccurate in Florence. Raphael would have thought he was sloppy.
Really?
He was sloppy and inaccurate. Just like Arnold Freeberg thought that Rockwell was sloppy and inaccurate and picking subpar models. Raphael would have hated this painting. He would have said, "What the hell, Titian? Like,
that's crazy.
These figures aren't beautifully lined up. They don't look, their gestures aren't leading directly to one another in a way that's very carefully chosen." He would have been so embarrassed that this didn't have the perfection, idealization, even in the strokes of that sleeve that's got the fur coming out of it on that figure, or any one of the figures. Titian reveled in the material looseness of the brushwork. Loved it. I just loved seeing the texture come out. Raphael hated that stuff, right? I mean, that is the stuff that is the difference between disegno and colore. So today, when I go into and I won't name names, but sometimes I'll go into these studios that are teaching figure drawing, and because the figure drawing is going from cast drawings that are taken from idealized statue, Greco-Roman statue, and then going into idealized larger forms, and then going to the figure, and they're working on line drawings, and then they're adding color later. Almost every one of them nitpicks paintings and the end results in the way that Raphael would nitpick Titian, right?
Yeah, you know what? And I've got to say something. Earlier you said I would know this because I have a school. The fact is, I am absolutely colore. In fact, we have 3D scans of real people's heads for casts.
Interesting.
Not idealized. Real people's heads. Old men, old ladies, different races. Just like literally 3D scans. That's what we use because I'm totally 100% colore. We're about precision, accuracy.
So anyone who's using the bark drawings and who loves them, I want you to go and egg Jeff's building now.
Yeah, I'm called an atelier, but I do not. I'm not. I mean, I'm not opposed to what they're doing. I think it's great. I admire them for it.
You know what's funny
it's just
about
a different
that? You know what's
taste.
funny about that is what's funny about that is that there's a great reconciliation that happens in the 19th century, or an attempt at it, and that's where you get people like Jerome, who he sponsors photography magazines and he sponsors the bark drawings at the same time. And then you get people like Carolus Duran and Leon Bonnat, who are teaching at the École des Beaux-Arts, and they all learned and worshipped Ingres and De La Roche, who are Disegno people, but then they become obsessed with Velázquez and Ribera. And Velázquez, the main patron of Velázquez, was also one of the main patrons of Titian.
Oh my
gosh. So Velázquez comes, and you can see it. Velázquez comes from the school of, he goes right onto the canvas for most of what he does, right? And the result of Velázquez is this really raw, observational life. He fits directly into the colore school, right? And the difference between Velázquez and Titian, one of them is that Velázquez, even though he works from the most powerful king on earth, Velázquez doesn't have any of the expensive colors. He's got cheap colors. So he's got a lot of ochres, a lot of bad blues, and Titian has all the best colors. So when you look at Velázquez, it looks earthy and realistic, but Velázquez would have loved to have Titian's palette. He just didn't have access to it, right? It would have been way more expensive for him to work. So you kind of like, and he's working like 50 years later than Titian's work, really. I mean, they're not really contemporaries, but they're close contemporaries. And Velázquez takes that colore route. I think that if you were to, put this painting, put the Mary Magdalene and the Catherine with the wheels side by side.
I don't know if we're going to be able to.
That one,
and
that one, they're not.
One.
And then this one. We don't need them to be perfect.
We can. Okay, good.
Okay. But, I don't know of any better comparison of colore versus, or Disegno versus colore than this Raphael on the left and this Titian on the right. The Disegno versus colore debate is, I think, one that art historians and that artists over time were obsessed with. Goya was a colore. Delacroix colore, Rubens colore, Velázquez colore, Ribera colore. You get, and I'm mostly in the Spanish world, so I'm thinking that, but you get others. You get, you get Constable versus his generation. Constable was considered a country bumpkin. Turner was considered colore versus the very careful work of other people. I think it's a really good way to think about how artists put together their work and think about their work in the terms of, you really, if you're observing from life and not inventing entirely, but you're using observable life, and that's part of it. That's the part that mostly gets caught up in the world of art. But if you were to say who leaned in more to the material of oil, was it Titian with colore, or was it Raphael with Disegno? And my answer would be that Titian, who is really the forefather of most oil painters in the material use of oil paint, because he is the one who's using it in the most pure way, by building up with it from the very beginning, whereas Raphael is largely continuing a tempera approach in his art.
I agree with that 100%. You really do. Yeah.
You get, but then you think, well, then why today are we still teaching people to draw from the very beginning rather than using oil from the very beginning? And it's because of this tradition of Raphael understood form and composition better than Titian did in his school. And so you study Raphael because arguably, I think this is what it comes down to. As someone who studied the history of how artists are taught, I think it's easier to teach Raphael. I don't want to diminish Raphael because I think Raphael, he's amazing. I mean, he really is. He's not necessarily our taste today, but that is a beautiful painting.
It's not about better or worse. That's not the conversation in my mind. It's, you know, let me tell you this. So I've been teaching for 20 years, 22 years. And when I have a student that can't seem to draw or can't seem to paint well, can't seem to paint precisely, I always give them the assignment, draw it first, transfer the drawing, and then paint. And then they can handle it. And then they do good work. Yeah. It is much more difficult to draw and paint at the same time. Now, I'm not suggesting that everyone in Raphael's time that drew first, that's the reason they drew first, was because it was easier. I'm not suggesting that. But I am saying that Titian had to be a great draftsman to be able to do what he did. And he did. Yeah. He did. And you've seen the drawings of Raphael. They're good, right? He's a great draftsman too. He's a great draftsman too. It's just, so is Titian.
I'm going to throw you a curveball. Okay. Near the end of Raphael's life, he did a portrait of the Pope, who was his patron. And this portrait, I want you to zoom in on the face after we look at it. This is Raphael near the end of his life.
Okay.
Look at the face.
Wow. It's kind of Titian-esque.
And then look at the tassels on your right.
It's like Titian.
Then look, and then look at his hands. Look at his left hand.
What? How about that?
I mean, and then look at the brushwork look at that hand that's resting on the edge of that chair.
Yeah.
I mean, that's beautifully observational, right?
So what happened?
It's not what we remember. Well, I mean, I think that as art historians, we like to exaggerate what people are, right? And we like to just put them in an easy category and say, he's all Designio, he's all about idealization. That is what gets carried down through the history of art as he's taught, is that they don't talk about this side of Raphael. Raphael's only 37 when he dies, right? He does this in his mid-30s. Who knows if he had lived into his 80s, just like Titian did, right? I mean, who knows where he would have ended up in the end. But the influence of his middle period works, of those simplified shapes, those simplified ovoid faces with the perfect part down the middle, the straight nose with the little dimpled nostrils, that is what has the biggest influence in the history of art more than any other artist. He becomes those things that are from his middle period become the template for almost every piece of art education for the next 4 centuries. This doesn't. And you look at this and you think, hey, wait, that's not the same guy. So I'm throwing you a curveball at the end, because there's a difference between, you know, how we think of our heroes and who our heroes actually are. Right.
Right.
And how we think of Raphael. And this is where I wanted to end it, is I wanted to say, you know, he wasn't as Designio as we like to think of him as, right? He's not as Designio. You look at this and you think, and some of the painting of this has thinned and become less, you know, clear as it would have been during his lifetime. But you can see enough of the painting to really admire him.
Well, even when he was idealizing things, he's an exceptional painter. You know, I see what you did there. It was like you were pushing both teams in the soccer game of these little kids playing soccer to just beat the crud out of each other. And at the end, you gave them all a trophy.
In a way I did.
Yeah, that was good. That was good.
I mean, when you look at this painting, it's, what do you think of Raphael?
Well, I liked him before. I mean, and you know, I would say this. I want to pull this painting up. I thought this face looked a little more Raphael-esque.
It does, and
A
there's
little
so
bit,
many
not a
different
lot,
versions
a
of it.
little bit. But
Yeah.
and I don't think this one of the Pope looks totally naturalistic either. It's just a little bit more naturalistic. It certainly doesn't cross over to this level, which feels almost like 19th century.
Well, and then you go to that early Titian of Bacchus, and that early Titian of Bacchus, that one, almost every one of them is an idealized form, except for those kind of that grotesque snake man in the foreground, right? I mean,
right.
That Bacchus isn't. It's not. He's more Disegno here than he is in almost any of the other paintings we've seen.
Yeah, but still not to the level of this.
Yeah.
It's almost like they're overlapping. They're overlapping in a lot of areas. It's but not the same.
If I were to have everybody who listened to this walk away with an idea that I want them to have, it's that there are real consequences for the materials that you have at your disposal. And they lived at a time when these two were able to use oil paints and canvas and invent new ways of approaching art that we still live with the consequences of, right? So Raphael and the Disegno school, he in the end was able to get, with that portrait of the Pope, to more of a fluid use of oil painting and a more naturalistic approach. But it's still built on the infrastructure of the temporal line drawing Disegno mindset of idealized form, color added, and then naturalism imposed on top of that form and line.
Mm-hmm.
And Titian is working largely with the mentality of, I want to build up oil and its transparencies and transitions in a way that's observed from nature. And I want to be able to use the material as it is fluidly. But he also realized that he needed to idealize things and simplify forms as he did it and create lines where there aren't lines in nature. Right? And oil doesn't want to be a line necessarily, but he forces it into lines where he needs to. So I think that, I don't think that either approach is right or wrong, but I think that you're going to look at your own heroes in your own personal pantheon of artists that you worship. And you may find after this discussion we've had, I tend more towards the Disegno people. And Jeff, you maybe didn't use this language before, but you're probably a little more colore than
definitely.
some of these people.
Yeah.
And the consequences of that are that, it's not whether or not they're better, but there is a definite different mindset of how they judge works of art based on are you the Arnold Freeberg looking at that Norman Rockwell, judging it that way, right? And saying, he could have pushed it a little farther and it would have been even better because it's not the best reindeer, right? Or are you Titian looking at Raphael saying, it's a little rigid, it's not, it doesn't feel like they're coming out and relatable and lifelike to me. I don't see in a flicker of candlelight those eyes moving towards me.
Mm-hmm.
They're different ways of looking at how a work is put together and the end result based on that philosophy.
That's a great conclusion. I like that. Hey, thanks again for doing the podcast, Micah. It was brilliant. I think it's one of my favorite ones.
It's so much fun. I love it.
I'm glad.
Thanks, buddy.
And have a great time in Europe. Tell us where you're going again.
I'm going to Spain. This is the year of the 100th anniversary of the death of Sorolla. So maybe I can come back and talk about some of that.
That'd be amazing.
And then I'm going to go to Italy. I'm going to be in Florence and Bologna and Venice. And maybe we can talk about that too.
That'd be awesome. We'll have a safe trip. We'll see you in a few weeks, hopefully.
Thanks, buddy.
Thanks for tuning in to the Undraped Artist Podcast. If you enjoyed it, subscribe. And if you could, leave a comment or review. That really helps the channel. Please share the show with your friends, and if you're feeling generous, consider a monthly donation at theundrapedartist.com. Thanks again for watching. We'll see you next week.